Right, so hi everyone. Welcome to our third Hout Bay Food Growers Sunday lockdown chats. Today we are going to talk about composting with worms because we've kind of covered it a little bit in the last couple of chats. And oh, I see. Oh, Ginny, you Virginia. I didn't know that. Hi, Ginny. Last couple of chats, I've talked a little bit about worm composting, and I'm also on a little bit of a worm composting mission at the moment because it's just so convenient in a small garden, which is what I'm dealing with, as well as being really useful in a large garden as part of a bigger composting system. I've also been sending my worms to new homes in the last couple of weeks. So I thought we could talk a little bit about the do's and don'ts of worm composting, and also just reassure people that it's actually not very complicated, and you should just go for it. So I've been reading this book that I found in Exclusive Books a couple of months ago, which has been really interesting because I've read it retrospectively after worm composting for a couple of years. It's called Worms Eat My Garbage, and it's a 35-year-old book, and which is really interesting. So it's obviously been republished with a couple of edits, and it's really interesting. It was obviously groundbreaking when it was first brought out, and to see how our worm composting methods have changed, but also to go back to the basics, and to see the original thoughts. So I can put this on the chat group later if anybody's interested in looking it up and reading it. So worms, as I said before, are an ideal composting solution for a small area, and I started my worm composting adventure when I moved to a flat with a balcony, and I had never lived without a compost heap, so I needed a solution. And I was gifted some nightcrawler worms from a friend of mine at work, and started my worm composting from then. So the benefits of a worm composting system as opposed to another kind of compact system like bokashi is that you get both a liquid feed and a very rich compost, and the worms go through the food very quickly. So if you're producing a lot of kitchen waste, and you want to get rid of it and not have it hanging around and smelling, and you just don't have time to do, composting on a large scale, then a worm composting system is really fantastic. If you have a massive garden, it's really great, I feel, to use in combination with all sorts of other composting systems, because it's kind of like your speedy fix. So even if you have the choice to put the choicest bits of composting material into your worm composter to get this lovely black gold worm compost or worm castings, and then to put the rest of the stuff into your larger compost heap, you get both options. It's also really nice because it doesn't smell at all. Well, this is one of the things to remember about if you have a worm composting system. If it starts to smell, there's something wrong. So that's a really easy tell. So if you walk past your worm composter and it's not smelling so great, then you've probably overfed it. So it's not really a difficult science to get things right as long as you follow your nose with the worm composting system. When I first heard about this worm composting concept, I was working as a very purist botanist and ecologist, and I was actually really concerned about the invasive potential of the worms. So with our gardening practices, where there's so much potential for not thinking about what you're bringing into your garden, and especially in South Africa, where we live so close to our pristine hopefully almost pristine natural areas. I think it's really important to think about whether something you have in your garden can spread into a natural area and become a problem. So I was really concerned about the invasive potential, especially because people don't think about stuff underneath the soil. And I was quite against worm composting, but since then, and I wish I had learned this earlier, I've learned a lot more about the worms involved. So there's a reason that you have to buy or get worms for your worm composting system from a friend, and you can't just use your average worms that you are finding in your soil. The worms for a worm composter are leaf litter dwellers. So they're not soil dwelling worms. They only live in the top probably 5 to 10 centimeters of the leaf litter or your compost, which means that if you are going to let them go in your garden, unless you have a really beautiful moist mulch layer that is always damp and always quite warm, your worms from your worm farm are just not going to survive in your garden, which is kind of sad in a way, because you think it would be lovely to introduce these worms to your garden so they can carry on working. But it's also quite reassuring that you're not going to introduce an invasive species. So there are two worms that you're likely to get here. The really common worm is the red worm or red wriggler, which is also known as a tiger worm. As I said, these are leaf dwellers or leaf litter dwellers. Yeah, they're the most common worms. They're really fast at getting through organic matter, which is why they're used. And if you have a worm composting system, you will notice that they're always just in the top layer. They're not going to move down. So one of the big issues I found with people who have worm farms and are mistreating them is they have this concept that you have to turn your worm farm. Please don't. It's very different to normal composting. Don't disturb the layers. So what's happening is as you feed your worms, you feed them on the top surface, they go up and they eat they process the waste, the top surface. You feed them on top of that and they move up and they move up and they move up, and below them will be the processed food or the worm castings. So if you turn that all over, they're still going to go to the top. So they're not going to eat through the unprocessed food that you've now turned to the bottom. So not turning your worm farm is one of the basic rules. The other worm that you might come across, and if you got worms from me, you'll probably have a mixture of these two worms, is the African nightcrawler. And this is a tropical worm. So in temperatures below 10 degrees Celsius, they will die. So I haven't actually looked at my worms to identify which are which at the moment, but because I've got worms from a couple of different worm farms now, I think I have a combination of the African nightcrawlers and the red wigglers. These work the same way as the red wigglers. Also leaf litter dwellers, and they survive only in the top level of the soil. So I am going to try and do a screen share, which I have not done before. So I can show you some options for housing for your wonderful worm farms. So let's go like this. There we go. Okay. Can you see this wonderful drawing of, thank you, that's great. So this is an image that I pinched from an article, which I will send the link, which is a really interesting worm farming article. I'll send the link on our WhatsApp group later, showing just a lovely diagram of a bathtub-based worm farm. So this is really nice if you've got a bigger garden and you've been renovating and you have a bathtub, or you know someone who's renovating and have an old bathtub. The advantages of using this quite large system is that the bigger your worm composting system, the more resilient it is. So there are some rules about what you can and can't feed your worms, but the bigger the system you have, the more it'll gracefully absorb things that you make a mistake with, like putting in too many citrus peels or too much onion or something that's going to turn it really acidic. So that's why I've worked at a lot of community vegetable gardens, and they favor this bathtub design. Can you see the whole design there? So what we've got here is the bathtubs conveniently have a plug hole. And what you'll do is, if you're setting up your design, is you're going to have to put some kind of a screen over your plug hole so your worms don't fall out. Then I see in this design, they've got a layer of coarse gravel and a layer of shade cloth. So also creating a bit of a sieve. And then on top of that, you've got your worm farm, and a lid really helps because you want to keep in the moisture and you want to keep out like direct heat. Also direct cold and too much rain from your worm farm, because you don't want them to dry out. You also don't want them to flood and drown. Those are the two things that having a lid is really useful for. Then also you can see the worm bedding. So there are a lot of different options, and I'll go through them later about what to use as worm bedding, but basically it's something pretty cheap and easy, like shredded newspaper, and that's the layer that they're going to work under. It's kind of like a duvet. So that's the bathtub worm farm. Then I'm going to show you a design that I really love, and I would love to build if somebody's got the tools and the skills. So these are worm farms that are made out of wheelie bins, and again, these are really cool because it's quite a big system, so it's quite resilient. And they've got these little hatches that you can see that you then, because remember the worm farm is creating layers, so the layer that is near the hatch will be, after you've been going for a while, will be your lovely worm compost, so you can just scoop it out without disturbing the worms. That is the drawback of using the bathtub method, is that if you want to harvest, so you'll have a continuous drip through your plug hole of the kind of liquid, what people call worm pee, but which is really leachate, which is a great fertilizer. But when you want to harvest your worm compost itself, then, sorry, how do I get rid of this? Go away. When you want to harvest the compost itself, you do have to take everything out of the bath, process it, catch your worms, put them back and start again. So that's quite labor intensive and not very practical if you've got like continuous amount of waste to deal with, because it might take a day or two. So that's why I really love systems where they take advantage of the layering action of the worms. So you can just scoop out what you want here. You've got a tap that drains off the liquid, which is really important because you don't want it sitting, drowning your worms in the bottom and creating an anoxic environment. And then you can still carry on adding in the top. So this is one of my projects that I'd really like to work on in the future, is to build some of these wheelie bin worm habitats. They're really great for community projects as well, I feel, especially if they're in places where it's a built up environment and you can go wheeling them around a concrete area. And then we have a photograph of my very unglamorous setup at home. So this isn't my favorite worm farm at the moment. I had a stacking system like this before, but it had smaller bins, which were easy for me by myself to carry even when they were full. But at the moment, I bought this system about 4 years ago, and the bins are actually just too heavy for me to pick up. That's a bit frustrating and takes away the convenience of it. I have to wait for someone to be around to help me. But what's happening here is we've got a 3-bin system. So each of these bins has drainage holes in them so that the liquid can drip from one bin into the other and collect in the bottom bin. The bottom bin is just holding liquid that's draining off the top 2 bins, which have the worms in them. And because my tap is broken and is continuously leaking, I've got a bucket under there. And depending on how much very wet food I feed my worms and how much I top them up with water, I might get a couple of cups full of liquid every couple of days. And then I've got a kind of a rotation system on which plants I favor with the liquid feed. So what's happening in the top two bins here is the very top one is my active bin. So that's where I take the lid off and I put just my choicest kitchen waste in it at the moment, because I'm producing so much waste that I just pick the best bits. And I have my VIP worm bucket in the kitchen, and I just give them the best bits of food at the moment. So that's where the worms are the most active. This middle bin is the bin that was full a couple of weeks ago, and so I swapped it around and put it in the middle. And that's where the worms are working through what's left of the waste. And as they work through the waste, they actually create a toxic environment for themselves. So there's a certain point at which it tips, and they create a toxic environment. And if they didn't have another bin to escape to, they'd actually start dying off. But that's where I really like this the stacked bin system, is as you continue adding bins to the top, the worms, when they create a toxic environment because they've eaten most of the food in the bottom bins, they can just move up through the drainage holes and move into a healthier environment. So you're not losing a lot of worms, as you might if you had, say, the bath system and went away for a couple of weeks and stopped feeding them. The worms have got nowhere to go. So that's why I really like the stacking system. And what will happen is in a couple of months, the worms will have eaten everything in the bottom bins and will have moved out by themselves, which is really great. So when I harvest the compost from the bottom bins, I don't have to be rescuing too many worms, which you would be doing if you had a bigger system like the bathtub, where you have to start rescuing all your worms when you are harvesting your compost. So that's why I favor the system. Basically the routine is also to keep a good layer of the bedding material, which for me is torn up egg boxes or torn up pieces of newspaper on top of the top bin, just to protect the worms happening there. And they will only work underneath that layer. So that is the kind of options of systems. There are also all sorts of weird and wonderful designs, but I feel like these are three really good options, whether you have a big or a small garden. Okay, let me go back to, oh goodness, okay, now the technical the technical aspect. Stop share, there we go, that's what I want to do. Sorry guys, I'm learning here. Okay, so those are your options for the home of your worm farm, and of course it's all up to you what you like. I really like the stacking system, especially if you've got a balcony, which is where I've started my worm farming. And as I said before, it shouldn't smell at all. And if it starts smelling, you've got a problem. So then we can move on to what you should be feeding your worms. And I think this is where a lot of people start to get a bit scared, and they don't know what to do, and they know there are rules, but they don't know what the rules are, and they don't want to kill all their worms. So the short answer there is your worms are quite resilient. The bigger the system is, the more resilient the worms are, and they might just get over it. Having said that, an acidic environment will kill them if you feed them too much and the food starts fermenting because you've created a warm and and moist environment, the food starts fermenting. The alcohol will kill them. So don't feed them 3 pineapples worth of pineapple skins, because then you're just making pineapple beer and your worms will die. So if there's anything that you think, I might wonder if I should feed them this or not, just play it safe and feed them just a little bit of it, as opposed to a whole bucket of citrus peels. So there are ways to be intelligent about it. What I'm basically saying is don't be too scared. Is just go for it. If your worms die, get some more from a friend and start again. Having said that, there is a list here. I need to do the shared screen thing again. Okay. Learning as I go along. Share screen. Right. So there is a list here. Now I've pinched this from a booklet that I made for a course that I gave. And this is a really simple list. So you can feed worms tea bags. Now I know we've had this conversation before that a lot of tea bags have plastic in them. So, you know, if you think your tea bags have plastic in them, maybe just tear them apart and put the tea in. Fruit and vegetable scraps. Coffee grinds. Eggshells are actually really important in a worm bin because they need the calcium to reproduce. So just make sure that you do put a few eggshells in. They can be a pain when you are getting out the compost, but they do need some eggshells. Newspaper, I would save the newspaper as a bedding material. Egg boxes, same bedding material, and leaves are also a great bedding material. So we did say fruit and veg scraps, but there's a list here of things you should avoid or avoid putting in massive quantities. So citrus, chilies, pineapple is one that I really had a problem with before. Potato peels, I must say, I never peel potatoes, so I've never figured out if this is really a problem or not. Garlic and onion. Meat is debatable. And I'll talk about that later. Milk, oily foods, and cooked foods. So now meat, milk, oily foods, and cooked foods, again, I'm going to say that the normal advice is not to use them at all. But again, if you've got a big system and it's resilient and you make sure that you don't have a lot of these substances and you bury them under the bedding, there is actually not a problem in putting cooked foods and meat. And I've put milk in into your worm farm. Again, if you've put a lot of meat in your worm farm and it starts smelling, you know it was too much for the worms to handle. But we certainly pick almost every scrap of meat off our bones. And I've put a lot of bones in worm farms, and there's not much left of it. So if you've got a big system and you've got some bones left over from your stew or your chicken, and you really don't have anywhere else to put them, I don't think there's anything wrong with putting it in your worm farm if it's a pretty active worm farm. I know in this book that I've been reading, The Worms Eat My Garbage, she puts everything in, including bread and all sorts of things like that. Just keep in mind that will they will take longer to break stuff like that down. So just proportionally keep an eye on it. A good way to know how much to feed your worms is the worms can eat their weight in a day. So if you know roughly the mass of your worms, then you can figure out how much you can feed them every day. So if you have a 3-liter bucket of worms, you can feed them a 3-liter bucket of waste every day. It's as simple as that. Obviously, their activity does slow down when it's colder. So like at the moment, I would slow down the feeding of my worms to prevent it getting smelly. As I said before, if you overfeed them, it creates a toxic environment. Also, if you underfeed them, it creates a toxic environment. So this isn't as scary a concept as you think, but it just makes a lot of sense to just keep an eye on your worms and their activity. If they start trying to escape your worm farm bin, then you know they're not happy, and then you need to alter something. So I spoke a little bit about the bedding materials. I use shredded newspaper or egg boxes. but you can also use leaves or cocoa fiber, and that's just a layer on top, like a duvet. That's protecting the worms from the environment, and they will work underneath that layer. So if you are being very good and about feeding your worm farm properly, what you want to do is when you get to the worm farm, you want to take up that layer of bedding material, put your food scraps underneath, put back the layer of bedding material. But if you're always in a rush like me, you just chuck the food scraps on top, and every couple of days you remember to add another layer of bedding material, because they will actually work through that. They will eat the newspaper or the egg boxes. Then I think Zoom might actually kick us off here. So I'm going to go quickly to some common problems with worm farms. So if your worm farm is too wet, let me just see if I can make this. If your worm farm is too wet, your worms are going to drown. And this could be caused by a clogged drain. So you just basically need to add more carbon or bedding material to act as a sponge, and wait for the worms to work through that. So don't add any water. If it's too dry, you need to add food and add water. Obviously, your worms need to live in a moist environment, and they're just going to dry out and shrivel up in a dry environment. So especially if it's really hot, make sure you haven't in summer put your worm farm in direct sun on the paving, because they're just going to cook. So you might need to move around. If you've got a smaller system and you can, move your farm around. In summer, put it in a cooler place. In winter, put it in a warmer place to get the best production out of it. As I said, it's pretty easy to find out if something's gone wrong in your worm farm, because it'll start smelling, and that's not great, especially if you've got it on a small balcony, or some people even have a worm farm in their kitchen. So too smelly, I would definitely add more bedding just to stop the smell, and also stop feeding it to get the worms a chance to work through things. You also need to check if it's smelly, that it's maybe not too wet and not draining. And then this is a problem that I have at the moment, and I think it's because we've just been through a dry summer, is I've got ants. And I was actually, it says here to add some agricultural lime because it might be acidic. And I was actually reading recently that you could use ash, which is something that I have a lot of wood ash in winter, and I'm always trying to find a way to do it. So this is something that I'm going to experiment with, is adding some ash to my worm farm. There is also the danger that too much ash is going to change the pH too much. So it's something I'm going to experiment with, and maybe if you've got a worm farm, you guys can experiment too, because I'm sure most of us have ash during winter. And that's basically, okay, share. That's basically my rundown on the worm farms and the how-tos. So we might have 2 minutes of this chat left or not. We'll see what Zoom does to us. And okay, there's a few questions here. So what are the benefits of worms over chickens? And I think that's, you can use both of them. Worms can process chicken droppings, and the problem with chicken droppings is that it's really acidic, and you can't put it straight onto your garden. You have to let it sit for a while. So once it's dry, you can actually feed the chicken manure to the worms. They will process it a little bit more and put it in a friendlier form, and also, of course, create that liquid feed that's really useful in the meantime. And then, do you need bedding if you have a lid? Yes. Think of it as their home. They're not going to work to the surface of your food waste if you don't have a bedding layer on top of the food waste. So, I mean, this is a mistake I make all the time, but my system seems to be quite resilient, is I don't have bedding on top because I get lazy and I just add all the food scraps on top, and they won't come to the top and work on those food scraps. So if it's really hot, those food scraps are going to start decomposing, and that could start smelling. And so that's why bedding is really important. And Are there any other questions? Now is your time to type, or wave your hand in the air and I can unmute you. Do you want to talk? Emmy?
I don't know. There. It's quicker than typing. In terms of compost versus worms, we sort of spoke about it last time. Whether the mission of separating and what you feed worms and what you can just chuck on the compost and what you get out of it, and whether the worm tea is worth it. Is there a point in having both the compost heap and the worm farm?
Definitely.
And what would you, I don't know, I'm sorry, I was late. I'm sorry,
That's
we had an
okay.
abscess and whatever, it was just chaos. So yeah, just when would you use the one and when would you use the other? I guess, like, what are the, you might have spoken about it, in which case I'll go.
No, that's fine. I haven't spoken about it in absolute detail. So I think there are, especially in a garden the size of yours, there are definite benefits in having two, or the worm farm and the compost. What I'm finding at the moment is I'm producing far too much for my worm farm. So before lockdown, I was going to set up